Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there's probably a loaf of bread, soft, white, sliced, the kind that sits on a shelf for 2 weeks and never seems to go stale. And depending on where that bread was baked, it might legally contain an ingredient that's been banned across the European Union, banned in the United Kingdom, banned in Canada, banned in China, and banned in Norway specifically, under the same food safety framework the European Union uses for over 3 decades. In the United States, that same ingredient is still legal. Not in every loaf, not even in most loaves anymore, if we're being fair about it. But legal federally with no warning label required, no disclosure on the ingredient panel beyond its name, and no requirement that a manufacturer tell you why one country decided this substance doesn't belong in food and another country decided it's fine. This video is about that ingredient, what it is, why it exists in bread in the first place, and why the gap between banned and legal isn't as simple as one side being reckless and the other being cautious. Then we're going to look at a second ingredient with an even stranger backstory, one that shares a name with something you might find in a yoga studio. And by the end, you're going to know exactly what to look for on a bread label in about 10 seconds without needing a food science degree. Let's start with the first one, potassium bromate. Potassium bromate is what's called a dough conditioner and oxidizing agent. Its job is simple. It strengthens gluten structure in flour, which lets dough trap gas more effectively as it rises. The practical result is a loaf that's taller, lighter, with a finer, more uniform crumb, the kind of soft, springy texture people associate with mass-produced white bread. It's cheap, it's effective, and for most of the 20th century, it was one of the most common additives in industrial baking used by large-scale commercial bakeries because it made their process faster and more forgiving. Here's the part that matters though. Potassium bromate isn't meant to survive the baking process. In theory, the high heat of the oven converts nearly all of it into potassium bromide, a completely different and largely harmless compound. That's the argument manufacturers and some regulators have made for decades. By the time the bread reaches your table, the bromate itself should be gone, converted into something inert. The problem is the word should. Under ideal baking conditions, the right temperature, the right baking time, the right dough thickness, conversion is close to complete. But baking isn't always ideal. Underbaked bread, thicker loaves, faster industrial baking cycles designed to maximize throughput, all of these can leave measurable residual bromate in the finished product. And residual bromate is where the actual safety concern comes in. In 1999, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the cancer research arm of the World Health Organization, classified potassium bromate as a Group 2B substance, possibly carcinogenic to humans. That classification wasn't based on human studies. It was based on animal studies, primarily in rats, where bromate exposure was linked to tumors in the kidneys, the thyroid, and in some studies a rare form of cancer called mesothelioma. The evidence in humans was described as inadequate, meaning there wasn't enough direct human data to draw a firm conclusion. Either way, not that human studies had ruled out a risk. Group 2B is a real, if cautious, designation. It sits below known carcinogen and above not classifiable. It is the category IARC uses when animal evidence is strong enough to take seriously, but human evidence hasn't caught up. That single classification triggered very different responses depending on where you were standing. The United Kingdom banned potassium bromate in bread in 1990, 9 years before the IARC classification even came out, based on earlier concerns raised by British food safety regulators. The European Union, once it began harmonizing food additive law across member states, extended that prohibition across the entire bloc. Norway, while not a full European Union member, is part of the European Economic Area and adopts European Union food safety regulations as a condition of that agreement, which means potassium bromate has been off the table in Norwegian bread for the same span of time as the rest of Europe. Canada banned it in 1994. China, Brazil, Peru, South Korea, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka have all prohibited it as well at various points over the following decades. The United States took a different path. The FDA has never issued a federal ban on potassium bromate in bread. What it has done is a much smaller thing. Since the 1990s, the FDA has strongly urged bakers to voluntarily stop using it without ever converting that recommendation into an enforceable rule. That's not nothing. Most large American bread manufacturers have, in fact, voluntarily reformulated over the years, partly in response to that pressure and partly to align with export requirements for the countries where bromate isn't allowed. But most isn't all, and voluntary isn't the same as prohibited. There's one exception inside the U.S. regulatory patchwork worth knowing about: California. Under a law commonly known as Proposition 65, California requires a warning label on any product sold in the state that contains a substance the state has identified as a potential carcinogen, and potassium bromate is on that list. So technically, a loaf of bread containing potassium bromate sold in California is supposed to carry a cancer warning label. That same loaf, sold one state over in Nevada or Arizona, requires no such warning. Same product, same ingredient, two completely different disclosure requirements because California built its own, more aggressive chemical disclosure system on top of the federal baseline, and no other state did the same. So to summarize where things actually stand, potassium bromate is banned outright, not restricted, not warning labeled, banned across the European Union, the United Kingdom, Norway, Canada, and a growing list of other countries based on an internationally recognized possible carcinogen classification from the World Health Organization's own cancer research body. In the United States, it remains federally legal, subject only to a voluntary industry recommendation and a single state's disclosure law. Most major manufacturers have moved away from it. Some smaller or regional bakers and some imported or specialty products still use it because nothing legally requires otherwise. Now let's talk about the second one, because this one has a nickname that tends to get people's attention: azodicarbonamide, usually shortened to ADA. ADA is a flour bleaching and maturing agent, a slightly different job than potassium bromate, but a related one. It whitens flour and helps condition dough, again producing that soft, uniform, commercially appealing texture. It's been used in a range of packaged breads and buns, particularly in fast food and quick service restaurant supply chains where consistency across thousands of locations matters enormously. Here's the detail that made ADA briefly famous outside of food science circles entirely. The same chemical, at industrial concentrations, is used as a foaming agent in the manufacturing of foamed plastics, things like yoga mats and the soles of some athletic shoes. It is genuinely the same base compound, used because it releases gas as it decomposes under heat, which is exactly the property that makes it useful both for aerating rubber foam and for conditioning bread dough. The concentrations and contexts are completely different. A shoe sole is not food grade, and food grade ADA is regulated separately under its own safety thresholds. But the fact that one compound serves both purposes is real, not an urban legend, and it is exactly the kind of detail that turned this into a public controversy once people found out. That controversy came to a head in 2014 when a food blogger's petition specifically calling out ADA's presence in a major American sandwich chain's bread gained national media attention. CNN, the New York Times, and most major US outlets covered it extensively. Within weeks, that chain announced it would remove ADA from its bread formulation in the US, a change it had already made in most other countries where it operated, because those countries didn't permit ADA in food at all. The European Union has prohibited azodicarbonamide as a food additive since 2005. Australia and Singapore restrict or prohibit it as well. The scientific concern behind ADA isn't about the compound itself so much as what it becomes during baking. As ADA breaks down under heat, it can form a byproduct called semicarbazide. Some animal studies have examined whether semicarbazide poses a cancer risk at elevated exposure levels, and the evidence, much like with bromate, has been treated differently by different regulators. The European Union concluded the uncertainty was sufficient to restrict the source ingredient entirely, rather than try to regulate trace byproduct formation after the fact. The FDA, again, permits ADA in food at specified maximum levels and has not moved to a federal ban, even after the 2014 controversy prompted several major companies to voluntarily reformulate. So you've got two ingredients, two different chemical roles. One strengthens dough, one bleaches and conditions it, and two remarkably similar regulatory stories. Banned across Europe based on possible risk classifications from international health bodies. Legal in the US, subject only to voluntary industry pressure, and, in bromate's case, one state's disclosure law. There's a third piece to this that doesn't get talked about as often, and it's less about safety and more about what whole grain and enriched actually mean once you dig into the fine print. In the US, a loaf can be labeled wheat bread while still being made primarily from refined white flour with a small amount of whole wheat flour or added coloring, caramel color, molasses, to give it a brown appearance that visually signals healthier without the product actually containing significant whole grain content. The specific term 100% whole wheat is more tightly regulated and does mean what it says, but wheat bread, multigrain, and made with whole grains carry much looser requirements. And manufacturers know that most shoppers don't distinguish between them at a glance. The EU rules on whole grain labeling are, in most member states, similarly imperfect. This isn't a case where Europe has it fully solved and the US doesn't. But several EU countries, including some Nordic countries, with particularly strict national guidelines layered on top of the EU baseline, require a minimum percentage of whole grain content before a product can carry certain grain-related marketing claims at all, closing some of the loopholes that exist more loosely in US labeling. One more ingredient worth a mention before we get to the practical part of this video: L-cysteine, another common dough conditioner used to relax gluten and make dough easier to machine process. Depending on the source, L-cysteine can be synthesized from petroleum byproducts or, and this is the detail that tends to surprise people, derived from human hair or duck feathers, both of which are industrial sources of the amino acid at commercial scale. It's permitted in the US and in a limited disclosed form in the EU as well. So this isn't a US versus EU story. It's just a genuinely strange fact about industrial bread production that most people have never had a reason to learn. And it's a good reminder that dough conditioner as a category covers a much wider and stranger range of substances than most ingredient panels let on. So standing in a grocery store, how do you actually use any of this? Here's the method: 3 checks, about 10 seconds total, and it works on any loaf, any brand, any country. First, scan the ingredient list specifically for the words potassium bromate or bromated flour. If either phrase appears, you are looking at a product that would not be legal to sell as formulated anywhere in the EU, the UK, Norway, or Canada. That does not mean the product is unsafe by US federal standards. It is legal, and the FDA has not banned it. It means you are looking at a genuine, verifiable difference in regulatory philosophy between where that bread was made and where equivalent products are made elsewhere. Second, look for azodicarbonamide or the letters ADA listed among the dough conditioners. Same logic applies: legal in the US, prohibited across most of the products you would find in a European bakery aisle. Third, and this one takes a bit more digging, if a product says wheat bread or multigrain without the word 100% attached to whole wheat or whole grain, check where whole wheat flour falls in the ingredient list. Ingredients are listed by weight in descending order. If whole wheat flour is 3rd, 4th, or further down the list, behind enriched white flour, water, and sugar, the marketing on the front of the bag is doing more work than the actual grain content inside it. None of this means every loaf of bread on a US shelf contains bromate or ADA. The reality is that most major national bread brands moved away from both additives years ago, whether from regulatory pressure, export requirements, or straightforward consumer demand. What this does mean is that the option to use them still exists federally, in a way it simply doesn't in most of the developed world. And that gap is worth knowing about the next time you're comparing a familiar brand name across two different countries and wondering why the ingredient panel doesn't quite match. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, ingredient labels, IARC and WHO classifications, and government sources. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and isn't medical advice. Regulations and product formulations change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand mentioned. If you want to see how this same comparison plays out with dairy, specifically the growth hormone that's banned across the entire EU, but still used in a large share of American milk production, that's coming next. Subscribe if you want to catch it.